All of this while I was doing so much as president, including creating the most secure border in American history, record tax and regulation cuts, $1.87 gasoline, no inflation, low interest rates, record growth in real wages, record growth in our economy, beating China and Russia and everybody else, rebuilding our entire military, the historic Abraham Accords, bringing peace to the Middle East, Jerusalem and Israel, much, much more.
So, first of all, it's great to be here, and thank you. Credit truly goes to Matt and Mercedes Schlapp, as well as Dan Schneider, for having the leadership and the foresight to bring CPAC to Israel for the very first time. It was an incredible trip. The trip took a 40-person delegation all over the land of Israel, and in the middle of that trip had the first ever conference in Israel with 3 former U.S. ambassadors under President Trump, former Attorney General under President Trump, as well as Ben Shapiro. There were 2,500 people that came to an event in Tel Aviv, and it's part of CPAC's vision to bring conservatism all over the world, including to Israel. And it was very meaningful to me as somebody who worked for the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, under the Trump administration, to be able to have a small role in being able to facilitate what is going to be an incredible journey for future CPACs in Israel next year and the year after.
Very good. First thing, I want a round of applause for Viana, who this is her first time moderating a panel at CPAC. She's been raised right, so congratulations, keep up the good work. Israel is the spiritual capital of the world. Jerusalem is the spiritual capital of the world. And it only makes sense that people of the Bible, people that want values, come to Jerusalem. They also came to the town that I work in, which is Hebron, which is the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. I mean, if we want to talk about conservative values, shouldn't we start at the tomb of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah? I mean, that's not just conservative values, that's actually the first family values, right? Here's the first family of Israel. So we went there as well, so that was very special. And I think that CPAC has what to learn from, and CPAC folks have what to connect to Israel, to learn from Israel. But at the same time, you know, Israel is a country that was formed, yes, 3,000 years ago, and 2,000 years ago we had First and Second Commonwealth. But in this latest iteration, in this third Commonwealth of the Jewish people, we had to do it kind of fast. We put it together through the times of the Holocaust, and it was kind of born right after the Holocaust, and it was slapped together kind of quickly. And when you look at the United States and you think about how the forefathers of this country worked so hard to create a nation and a state that had these incredible values, the most central value of which is that the people have to love their country but distrust their government. Now that's a very special gift that the United States brought into the world, checks and balances. Israel was formed from a more communistic place. It came out of Russian Jews. And so when CPAC comes to Israel, and when Ben Shapiro talked about judicial reform, when he talked about getting rid of bureaucracy, I was like, good, CPAC has got something to teach Israelis as well. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship, and I'm really glad that you guys came. Thank you.
I would add to that, first of all, if you can and you want to, come next year. I think it was such an amazing trip. It was my first time in Israel, and several things just struck me. First of all, you know, it's just the history, but not only the history, but how it sits today. So you have a modern Israel where people live and work, and then at the same time, you have a country and a place that so many important historical events happen. You know, we went to Bethlehem as a Christian, going to Jerusalem and walking the Stations of the Cross and all of those things. But at the same time, the modern part really struck me because I was on a panel with the former Minister of Justice, and to talk about how Israel as a country currently doesn't have a constitution, that they're actually still using laws from the Byzantine Empire, and thinking about how all that stuff you learned in Western Civ recently, how it all actually applies to this place in this time. And so it was really just extraordinary to be in that. It was a tremendous opportunity, and I think one of the things that I think is so interesting and so like it's an honor to be a part of is the conservative movement in the world. You know, in the United States, we have our challenges and our battles, and we're still advancing the rule of law and liberty, but at the same time, sharing that same message and trying to teach and translate American freedoms to the world is just, and this was a great opportunity to do that in Israel.
So, David, you worked in the U.S. Embassy, which was moved to Jerusalem thanks to President Trump. You had a front row seat to the negotiations, especially with the Abraham Accords. Now, could you tell our audience a little bit about this and just like the importance of these accords?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Abraham Accords was a historic agreement that the Trump administration facilitated between Israel and 3, 4, and then eventually 5 other Arab countries in the region. And this was extremely important for a number of reasons. First, it actually showed and blew through the myth that often exists in public policy among people in the foreign policy establishment who wrongly thought that the failure to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are what actually drives violence in the Middle East. And that's actually not the case. What really drives violence in the Middle East is the threats that are coming from Iran, the leading state sponsor of terrorism, who actually pose a threat to both Israel and a number of Gulf Arab states. And if you go back to 2015, Prime Minister Netanyahu actually had the courage to come to Congress, if you recall, and speak out against the Iran deal, not just as an existential threat for Israel, but also as a tremendous security threat to America. He did that even though President Obama at the time was pushing forward on it. The Trump administration came in, and President Trump had the courage to leave the deal because it posed a threat to America and our allies, including Israel and the Gulf Arab states. And Israel and the Gulf Arab states started to recognize, wow, we have a real friend in Washington, D.C., and you see a president who, contrary to previous presidents, was going to fulfill his promises to Israel because they're in America's national security interest, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, taking on the Iranian regime for really the first time and imposing maximum sanctions on them. All these various big decisions, people thought it would actually create more violence in the Middle East, and actually by embracing Israel and showing the world that Israel and America are in a common fight against the enemies, really, of Western civilization, and also bringing along the Gulf Arab states, we were able to bring historic peace in the region. And really the future for all of that can be positive. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is trying to reverse and appease the Iranian regime and appease the Palestinians and go back to the failed policies of the past. So they're not going to be as successful in these endeavors. But what's good is that Israel and these Gulf Arab states, which for years had behind-the-scenes relations, have now, through the Abraham Accords, created these strong agreements publicly and are standing united against the Iranian regime, but also, frankly, they're standing united against the Biden administration right now, which is trying to rejoin and create an even worse Iranian deal that's terrible for the free world. And so the path forward is really for us to continue to build upon what has worked, and ideally in 2022 and maybe in 2024 we can have a president who moves forward in the right direction.
So we're talking about Israel and peace, but unfortunately many of Israel's neighbors are not looking for this same peace. Rabbi, I would like to turn to you, because you are actually from Israel. Could you give us a little taste of what it's like on the ground there when we're looking at rising anti-Semitism here and abroad, Iran closer to getting nuclear weapons, the ongoing threat of terrorism? What concerns you?
Well, first thing is that we're a post-Holocaust country, and we've been through a lot, the Jewish people. So when you say these things to me, it's not like I'm like, oh my God. I'm just like, okay, that's another challenge that we have to deal with. We've been through the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, and we'll get to the Iranians, and the Iranians. We can't allow ourselves, we're people of faith in God and also of the strength that God gives us. So So we can't allow ourselves to get too nervous. At the same time, we're on guard. And I just went shooting the other day, practicing my own firearms training. And we have to do that. We got to be, every one of us has to be prepared in Israel. Every one of us is like a police officer in a sense, a defender, certainly a military person. You know, I want to talk about the Abraham Accords for just 1 second because it's related. The Abraham Accords is really the vision of peace in our region, which is a strong Jewish Israel, surrounded by strong Arab countries, living together and working together in concert for a better Middle Eastern region. And it's happening. It's a much better idea than cutting up tiny Israel, giving it to the Palestinians who are jihadists, and having raining rockets just like we have from Gaza. That's a bad idea. Anybody can see that. The future is the Abraham Accords. But I want to just for a second stop and talk about the name Abraham Accords. The name itself is a fight. The name itself is a fight. Because one of the fights that your children are facing on American campus is the language of occupation, colonialism. The idea that Israel is a white colonialist settler state taking over somebody else's land. A theft narrative. And that is one of the biggest lies out there, as though Jewish people are not from the land of Israel, we're not from Judea, as though there were some kind of like Germanic people taking over somebody else's land. That's one of the biggest lies out there. The Abraham Accords, the name, is an attack on that attack. It's a defense against that attack, because it says, no, we're part of the Abrahamic region, we're Abrahamic peoples. We are related here. And in fact, the first Abraham Accords happened in the city that I work in, which is Hebron, which is when Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury, it's the father of the Jews and the father of the Arabs, came together to bury their shared father Abraham in Hebron. So that's the first Abraham Accords. And I always tell my Arab interlocutors, let's come together to honor our joint father. Let's make peace in order to give our father some comfort. The Abraham Accords was not, it was the move was a fruit of people like David and David Friedman and other people, and of course President Trump. But the name came from a general who was a Puerto Rican two-star general, an American general, who ran into the room and said, you guys have a name? They're like, no. And he's like, how about the Abraham Accords? This is what David Friedman told me. And Donald Trump, President Trump said, well, it would be nice if it was called the Trump Accords. But it ended up, he accepted the idea that it was the Abraham Accords. And I think that name says we are from this area, we're from this land, and we give honor together to our forefather Abraham.
What concerns you? What concerns you about Israel, about the situation?
Well, I mean, it is obviously a region that has always known conflict, whether, it's the Crusaders, whether it's the Persians, whether, whoever was moving through that area. And there's a reason that every Israeli citizen has to serve in the military. It's a preparedness, as the rabbi was talking about. And so, it concerns me that if you know your Bible, there may be future conflict in the region, maybe, the ultimate conflict in the region. And so, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that also that Iran, if not contained, if allowed to become a nuclear power, will not only be an existential threat to the state of Israel, it will also require everyone else in the region to develop nuclear capabilities, and I think that is never good. We have lived with that through all of our lives, that there are nuclear powers in opposition to each other, and we don't need more to join in the world. So that's my biggest concern. The second concern that I have is Israel, because of their politics, because of the Knesset and the way they do their parties, it is not guaranteed that it won't ultimately become a socialist state. My sense is that the people are conservative, the people are, Bible believing, but at the same time, I worry about one of our best ally in the region and one of our closest allies in the world would tip into sort of a socialist agenda that is not good for the American people long term.
I want to give you all 1 minute, since we're coming to the end, to tell our audience, why should everyone go to Israel? What is important? What do you find most interesting about it? Why should they go?
Me? Okay. Right now I'm working on a project which is it's an American ideal. Sometimes we take ideas from America, yes. So we have what to learn as well. And I love this idea of Route 66 that you have here in America, this like heritage highway. So I had this idea that we actually have a road called Route 60, and it's an ancient biblical highway, and it has on its 7 holy nation cities: Beersheba, Hebron, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Bethel, Shiloh, and Shechem, all on one road. And this is basically like 90% of the Bible took place on this road. And I am actually working in the Israeli government to change the name to Route 60, the Israel Biblical Highway. I want to make sure that everybody here at CPAC, I want to make sure that Bible-loving people, values-loving people, defense-loving people, national and patriotic-loving people will come to the Israel Biblical Highway, go down that highway and say, yeah, I did the Israel Biblical Highway. I came to these cities. I stood in the place where Jacob had the dream of the ladder. I came to the tomb of Abraham. I drank water from Abraham's well. I want the whole world to do that, and certainly the people here. So you're invited to be part of the Israel Biblical Highway.
Israel is the place to go to see the Bible come to life. No better place to do that. Jerusalem is the place where our Judeo-Christian values come from, and really are the heart and soul and the foundation of the strong relationship between America and Israel. And also, you get to see that the lies that are put out there by the media, by the New York Times, and so many, even what we hear on college campuses and others, as Yishai was saying earlier, that Israel is supposedly taking over illegal Palestinian territory, or it's an occupation or colonization, all lies, and you get to go see the fact that the Jewish people have a historic and legal right to live all throughout the land of Israel, and that this goes back thousands and thousands of years, and you also get to see archaeological discoveries that reaffirm these historic connections for Jews and for Christians and many others, and really push back against the false narratives that exist. And finally, you get to see that this tiny country, a country that, by the way, does receive the highest amount of military assistance from the United States, but only asks for the backing and the wherewithal, the military capabilities to be able to defend themselves by themselves. They actually don't ask America to fight the wars that they're dealing with, although it happens to be that they're fighting against enemies that also threaten not just Israel, but America. And you'll get to see the threats that unfortunately exist all around Israel's borders. And unfortunately, when more conflicts do take place, you'll have a much better sense of why it's so important that all of us stand together publicly in support of Israel, because really when Israel takes on the enemies of Israel, they're also taking on the enemies of America.
You were with us on the trip, and so I'm actually going to yield my time to you, because I would love to, you've been asking all the questions, I would love to hear your perspective, because you were there and you saw it all, and what impression were you left with?
I will say I was blessed to go with my family, so both my parents and my 4 little sisters. We were quite a gathering, you could say. We're a little bit loud and lively. We had the opportunity to go to just all these holy sites that I never even dreamed of seeing, and really there are no words to describe how important Israel is, and I never really thought I'd go, but like laying your hand on the tomb where Jesus' body was, the blood was taken off of him after he died on Calvary, was like, I will never come close to that experience my whole life. If all of you could do that, I would pay for your ticket, but I'm not there yet. I'm still working off the college loans, so. Anyway, thank you all so much for being on the panel. Thank you.
Anna, one more thing.
Yes?
You know what I love here in Texas? Buc-ee's. With all that stuff, and I'd love to see more Israel stuff at Buc-ee's. If anybody knows anybody at Buc-ee's, let me know. God bless you guys.
Thank you so much.